Hello and welcome to another episode of Jacket Tie and FlipFlops, a light-hearted podcast on work, life, and more. Every episode, we hope to feature an industry leader who has embraced change, hurdled over the obstacles, and inspired teams and people around them. Today, we have a very special guest, someone who has more than a decade of experience in our wonderful world of media, a very respected professional in the industry, and someone who I can personally count as a very dear friend. Siddarth Correya, or better known as Sid in business and his social circles. Thank you, Sid, for making time to be with us. Let's start with a brief introduction on your journey so far, and then let's quickly hit you with some questions we have from our listeners. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jules. So glad we are doing this, and so glad that you have decided to do this podcast. Because I think it's, I'm a huge fan of podcasts, and I think it's always good to get a fresh voice. And your voice is a very bold, fresh voice with no filter. So I appreciate you doing this. My journey, well, I think the standing joke that I have for myself is the fact that I kind of figured out this whole idea of being a nomad or a digital nomad before it became a thing. And I think that's quite reflective in my career and the journey that I've taken as an individual, which started in India, then went to Indonesia, in Singapore, back to Indonesia, India, and now back again in Singapore. I think I feel very privileged and very fortunate that for me, the highlight of this entire journey has been the people that I have met. People who've been inspirations, whether they were peers, whether they were managers, whether they were friends like yourself. And two is kind of the width of experience that I was able to get, starting in sales, moving into agency world, working with some, iconic brands across these markets. Fun fact, the first kind of proper corporate job that I ever held was actually with the Times of India, selling print. And from there, I moved on to like mobile advertising, digital, and so on. Right. So it's been a long, circuitous journey. I won't bore you and your listeners to death because, as you would have noticed already, I can ramble on. But it's been a very, very fun ride so far.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, man. So if we don't find Sid crunching numbers, drawing up plans and doing those knowledge sharing sessions that you're so good at, what would we see Sid doing?
If it's at home, very, very likely I will be in the kitchen or I will be listening to music or watching some content. I'm hugely, hugely passionate about food. If you meet me in person, you will understand what I'm talking about. I have gone from a size S to now I think it's a double XL, and that is entirely because of my love for food. So I view a lot of content around food. I love to cook. I love to discover new recipes. I travel because of food. So a lot of my motivations are provocated by food. The other thing is that of late, I'm trying to spend time to really understand how people and businesses operate, not approaching it from the lens of just theory and philosophy, but trying to kind of understand, what makes people tick. Like, what does it take to be a CEO or founder? What does a workplace look like a few years from now? So I think those are areas that kind of interest me. And I do spend some time trying to find content or people that I can have these discussions with.
Thank you for sharing. No, there is a famous saying, you never trust a skinny chef, right? Listen, I've been around your dining table quite a few times, and I'm testimony to what you can whip up or rustle up in the kitchen. Coming back more to something that I hear all along being discussed in corridors, whispers, and now it's become such a big thing in the corporate world. The question that most people grapple with around this subject called work-life balance. Yeah. In your opinion, is this a myth or a real problem?
That's a very nice, or as I would say, very spicy question, Jules. So honestly, I personally think it's a real problem. But at the same time, I will caveat that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's one of these prickly problems that I think has been kind of accentuated on the back of COVID and how the workplace has totally changed. And I do believe that this is not a discussion that is had in a lot of workplaces. Different people view it in different ways. There is a huge context of lifestyle, life stage, where you are, what you do, and so on. What I can definitely say, and I'm just putting my senior person hat on for a second, that there are certain rules that I think are universal, apply to most of us. So the first is, I think as an individual, you need to be very clear on the purpose of your job for yourself. For some people, it could be money. For some people, it could be quality of work. For others, people, fame. The other thing is you have to distill that you can't have it all. I find it very utopian when someone says that, I have the most perfect job. I fundamentally don't believe in that. Right. So you have to be very clear that what is your motivation. The second is, and this is something that, it takes a long time to recognize, is I very, very strongly believe that you should not be defined by where you work and what you do. Titles, what you do, your designation, they're all fluid. You might have a very large title in a very large organization, but you might be someone who's starting off on his own and so on. Right. So please, like I learned this the hard way, that we put ourselves into these buckets where we get defined as individuals by where we work. And I think that's really not good. Simply because for every person that you see within the vicinity of where you work who is really successful, that you look up to, there are lots of other people who are just average Joes like myself, who are just there to get the job done, who come in, have some fun at work, go back to their families and so on. Right? So it's fine to treat work that way. And the third, which I think is if I was to just be a bit serious for a little moment, there was this analogy that I heard someone from Google, if I believe correctly, speaking about, which has really stood with me. So this person talks about the fact that, life is like constantly juggling several balls. And there are certain balls that are more fragile than others. So for instance, the ball of family or health is probably made of glass, because if it breaks, it's very difficult to kind of bring it back together. But the ball of salary, of designation, of title is like a rubber ball. It falls, it bounces back. And it sounds super simplistic, but I think it's something that all of us should really internalize, because that helps you as an individual set a much better context of, whether your work-life balance is actually a problem and what do you do to correct it. Because the reality, Jules, is that a company can only do so much. And I'm saying that as a company man myself. But there are multiple instances where you can actually make certain decisions. You can design a path that is more favorable for yourself. Sorry, a bit of a long-winded answer, but I hope it covers what you were trying to get to.
No, absolutely. And it is perfect. I love the analogy, and definitely something that, this podcast is all about that. It's about someone's personal opinion towards a subject as heavy as this. We've seen a lot of subjects come and go at corporate, but some of these have stuck with us for 3 decades, right? And this is one subject that everyone wants to discuss, but no one wants to discuss it. And thank you for sharing. Having won, through your journey, I've seen you've been a manager, you've groomed yourself as a successful leader in the business. Is there a way to identify colleagues going through a rough patch? And what do you think is the best approach in this situation, given it could be personal, it could be official, or wearing a hat of a manager / leader? How do you identify these things, and what's the best way to approach it, in your opinion?
Again, really good and a very meaningful question, Jules. So I think there are certain visible signs, but at the same time, there are certain factors that you can and certain factors that you cannot control. So in a very simplistic way, if I was to just break this down as a very simple framework, which I think anyone can apply, is certain visible signs are things like timesheets. I think most of us work in companies where there is some form of time management, whether it's a clock in, clock out, or you're filling hours against client work or whatever that may be. The second is just people's time in office. Is there someone in your team, in your vicinity? It does not necessarily have to be someone who works directly with you. That is always the first person in, the last person out. To me, one very powerful way is that I do, in a focused way, look at when people tend to send their first messages of the day and the last of the evening. And that is an instinctive way for you to understand, okay, here is an individual who is sending out emails at 2 in the morning or at like 6 in the morning. And it doesn't take much to reach out to them and try and understand why that is happening. But when you're addressing these, I think, again, going back to my first point, you need to be mindful of things that you can and cannot control. Now, as a manager, I cannot make a sweeping decision on the back of the company and tell people that, all right, it's fine to come in at 3 p.m. and leave at 6 p.m. What I can do is, again, a simple exercise, which is speak to people and try and work with them to break down what an average day and average week looks like and go really granular. This is something that has really stood with me and has been very successful in helping me also as a manager to understand where people's time is being spent. Part two would be that, within that breakdown of a day or a week, ask for that individual to apply a priority to the various tasks and also look at tasks that are recurrent or also ad hoc ones. If you just get to this point, Jules, you will already look at a calendar where you as an external sometimes will know immediately that, okay, these are areas where a person is spending an unusual amount of time that are not contributing to the business and worst of all, not even to that individual's growth. Then you need to have a conversation to see how can you reduce that time and then potentially intervene. Like if I was to give you one anecdote, I was talking to a colleague of mine last year where we did a similar exercise. And one of the things I discovered was that she was spending more than 60% of her time on online meetings. And some of these meetings were at, ridiculous hours like 4 in the morning and 2 in the morning, because she was inadvertently being added into some of these global calls. And she believed that at her stage in the industry, in the current company, she wasn't permitted to kind of refuse those calls. So that's where you as a manager can intervene. It's these small things that go a very long way. Personally, I get a bit frustrated where we take very grandiose stances around, improving these things and so on. Yes, there is there's a place for that. There's a place for creating the right support systems. But I think within the radius of how you work within your team, within your peers, within your colleagues and friends in an office, I strongly believe that, you can make these very small kind of interventions, but they go a very long way in also helping people look at a point of view that they may not realize.
Very interesting, especially the fact that to get people to understand controllables and the uncontrollables that you spoke about is such a simple yet so difficult conversation to have, right? Absolutely, and thanks for that. In my view, and I see a lot of in all of these discussions that we've had some time, have with lots of other people, is this post-COVID era. It's kind of changed the way we work, we collaborate, and we build together. Hypothetically, 20 years from now, just to take a punt into the future, what would you think the ideal workplace look like 20 years from now?
So, Jules, one thing is certain, that there are certain types of jobs that will just not exist. So if I was to do a quick look back into time, roughly 7 years ago, I held a title which was Mobile Media Director within a large media agency.
Okay.
That role does not exist anymore in most large agencies. But today you have roles like e-commerce director and all, which did not exist like 3-4 years back. So I don't look at it as this dystopian scenario that, 40% of jobs will go away and so on. I think that with those jobs going away, through whatever, automation, new categories coming up and so on, there will be newer jobs that will be created. Now, the question that we all have on our minds is then how do we survive and thrive? Right? I think, if both of us are getting to a certain stage in our career where somewhere in our minds there is always this feeling that, okay, I am more dispensable than I was 4 or 5 years back, because potentially I could be replaced by someone younger who comes in with a view that I may not own because of whatever. To me, there is one simple thing which I very, very, very much believe in, and a lot of people that I have spoken to have kind of corroborated this, is that the curious will win. I think if you're someone who is just curious, who is constantly looking to learn, who's constantly looking to upskill yourself. I mean, I'm currently, there are two of us relatively senior people in this industry who are now doing a podcast with you having figured out how podcast technology works, that's super powerful because it's a curiosity in you that is driving you to do this. And I think that's something you can never let go of, simply because the tools that you have, the hard skills that you have in certain industries are very easy to acquire. I always take this position of humility that in our industry, in the communications industry, there is much more that you learn from intuition rather from just kind of, hard skill development. But that intuition is directly correlated to how curious you are, how much you want to learn, how much you're putting yourself out there. So that is my fundamental belief that, a lot will change, but there are certain things that will not change at all. The other, if I may just add, is that I also believe that personally, I would not ever want to be in a world where everything is 100% remote. Like a couple of days ago, I was listening to Mark Zuckerberg talk about a future that he envisages where everything is remote. We are all talking to not just each other, but each other's online avatars and so on. If my online avatar is something that takes care of, my 6 a.m. or 4 a.m. calls, love it. Absolutely do it. But I don't think that will replace the fact that you and me will catch up physically, or I will catch up with a bunch of colleagues and we will ideate together, we will synergize together. And I think that's not going to go away simply because we are social animals. There's huge value in hybrid, these new structures that have come in. But I think, you don't want to live in a world where your only human interaction is on online medium. You do want that physical interaction. You do want to smell the tension and the success in a room. You don't want to kind of shake someone's hand. And that I really, really believe is not going to go up.
Awesome. Quick last question, and this is for anyone stepping into the, I wouldn't call it the big bad world of corporate, but the big exciting world of corporate.
Sure.
In your view, having groomed many youngsters and, run multiple teams, what do you think are the three things that every career-hungry youngster should know before they put their first step in?
So, Jules, I think very simply speaking, the first is that the decisions that you make in the first 4 to 5 years of your career, they have a very long, very deep impact on where your journey goes. And I can say this of multiple people, that if you reflect on, like I am fortunate enough to work with colleagues who've been in the game like 25 years, 26 years. It is profound that they will still remember very distinct instances that happened to them in the first year of their job, the third year of their job. They will remember with a lot of fondness experiences, people that they had at that stage. So I think that formative bit, like you just go out there, throw yourself into the deep end, is really important because it shapes you not just as a professional, but as an individual. The second, and this is something I get increasingly frustrated about, is that as people, and this is pronounced in certain industries, we are constantly looking ahead. We're looking for the new. Yes, the world is changing, but not everything has changed. If I look at our industry, I think looking back as well as forward is equally important. Because there are certain fundamentals, like, it's not that today's consumer is buying in a way that is just entirely different from how they were buying 50 years ago. Yes, today's consumer may be buying on an online channel rather than a retail outlet, but their motivations to buy, the catalyst to buy, have not really changed that dramatically. So I think it's very, very important to look back as well as forward, to just very quickly build on that. There are two industries that I follow very, very closely because I think there's lots of learning to unpack. So one is the venture capital industry. The other is just the tech industry, like, tech sector. If you see the biggest successes within these two industries, I would say every one of them is a deep and very avid follower of history. And then you would ask yourself that, okay, why is someone who's building a startup in AI optimization for agri-tech really worried about history? And then you will figure out that there is so much that they learn from what has happened earlier in terms of culture, society, anthropology. And I think that's something that a lot of young people are missing. And the last, which is, simple, you can interpret it whichever way you want, is find your superpower, get known for that, and keep building on that. I think it's very important. A superpower is not just a skill. A superpower, like I am known by a lot of people as this guy who injects humor into difficult situations. That is a superpower I'm proud of, and I keep building on that, and I'm known for that. That's really, really important because that becomes your brand.
Awesome. You should never change. Of course, I have
Thank
to
you.
agree with you. Thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Jules.
being with us, Sid, and just love chatting with you as always.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wishing you all the best in your future endeavors. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to Jacket Tie and Flip Flops, the podcast that helps you share, learn, and grow. If you have any questions you want our next guest to answer, or you have someone you want to suggest as our next guest, please write into Jacket Tie FlipFlops at gmail.com. See you soon.